Welcome to Health Hacks. So we are going to speak about longevity today. And as we all know, what is very important for our longevity are our stem cells. How can we maintain healthy and strong stem cells? For that, we need to focus on our mitochondria. And that is going to be the topic of today's conversation. And I'm having Dr. Alexis Cowan with me. Thank you for being here today again in person. I'm very happy to have you.
I'm so glad to be here. It's always fun having a conversation with you, and I'm sure we're going to delve into a lot of really important topics today that will help people just live healthier lives.
So yeah, I'm going to start into today's conversation speaking about stem cells, longevity, mitochondria health. What are stem cells? I think that is something that everybody should understand from the beginning. Stem cells are basically not specified cells in our body. So they can turn into muscle cells, they could turn into skin cells. It depends on the signal your body would give. So basically they can replace broken and damaged cells. Where you see your stem cells basically working right in front of your eyes is when you cut yourself. So when you cut yourself, you'll have a wound and you're bleeding, but after a certain amount of time, your skin will heal over it. And that is exactly when your stem cells would come and build new skin tissue. So the older we get, the fewer amount of quality stem cells we will have. And that also explains why a young child would heal a wound much faster, while the more we age and the older we are, the longer we take to heal. So this explains you how important it is to take care of our stem cells in order to maintain a healthy and strong body. Now, these stem cells, as I said, they can replace broken and damaged cells. I'm not only speaking about when you really actually hurt yourself, I'm also speaking about maintaining healthy muscle mass. And the muscles that I'm speaking about is not the muscles that when we go to the gym, of course, those ones as well, but also in maintaining a heart muscle, maintaining a strong and healthy body. Now, in terms of how do we maintain strong and healthy stem cells? We have to focus on our mitochondria, because mitochondria are basically the powerhouse of our cells. And mitochondria determine cell death and also the cell survival. So focusing on the mitochondria will eventually lead us automatically to have healthy stem cells and to live a long and healthy life. So focusing on longevity, we need to have healthy mitochondria. Now, I want to ask you as an expert, what would you recommend people in terms of keeping healthy mitochondria? What can you do to maintain healthy mitochondria in your daily life? What would be maybe the number one recommendation? That, of course, our conversation is not going to only be one thing, but what would be the first thing that kind of comes into your mind?
Yeah, so I mean, it's important to define exactly what mitochondria are. You mentioned the powerhouse of the cell, so they do make cellular energy currency in the form of ATP, but they're also very much so electromagnetic sensors and also emitters. So essentially what that means is that mitochondria are both sensing and emitting light. And the light that they sense is not only in the visible part of the spectrum, so the light that you could receive from your light bulbs and from the sun, for example, but also non-visible light, which would be in the form of infrared light, UV light, but also all of the EMFs that we use for our communication technologies, such as Wi-Fi, 5G, 4G, 3G, Bluetooth. All of those are also light in the radio frequency range, and all light our mitochondria are detecting. So the best thing you can do to support your mitochondria at just a very basic level is to be mindful of your light environment and trying to receive natural light sources into your body and into your mitochondria as much as possible, which essentially boils down to getting plenty of time outside in the sunlight, because that's the primary electromagnetic frequencies that our bodies and our mitochondria evolved to detect, because we didn't have any of these, artificial light sources or radio frequencies in our environments, even, just maybe 500 years ago or less.
Yeah, so they basically, our artificial light constantly disturbs with our mitochondria. So the more we get outside, the more we go into nature, essentially getting the natural sunlight, it helps to maintain our mitochondria health. That is so many people think we have to avoid the sun for longevity and maintaining healthy skin and all of this. And in reverse, actually, no, because we are supposed to get a lot of sunlight on us. Of course, we have to protect ourselves. So even if it is that you put sun protection or if you go into the shade, but you still need to receive enough sunlight from a natural environment. that is very essential. And also, if we want to like speak about the environment for us in order to maintain healthy mitochondria, we want to try to avoid as many stressors as possible. Speaking about all these chemicals that we're exposed, all of this is ruining essentially our mitochondria health. And so there are like the chemicals and things are like when you go, the air pollution that we probably can't avoid because it's just the way we live in our today's society. But then there's also like the kind of like chemicals that a lot of people do on purpose. So the more we can avoid that, speaking about smoking, drinking alcohol, all these stressors on the body, the more we can avoid it, the better is essentially our mitochondria will function and be stronger and healthier.
Yeah, and also worth mentioning is that mitochondria, evolutionarily speaking, are derived from bacteria. So there's this theory, we may have touched on it last time, called the endosymbiont theory, which basically states that mitochondria were derived from bacteria in this like ancient organism where a single-celled organism fused with the bacteria, and that became the mitochondria. And so I mention that because things that harm our bacteria, which we also talk about the microbiome all the time and its importance, well, when we're harming our bacteria, whether it's our microbiome or outside of our bodies, we're also going to be potentially harming our mitochondria as well, because bacteria and mitochondria share a lot in common with regards to the way that they function. So both of them have a double membrane system, both of them have circular DNA, and just the biochemistry of the way that mitochondria and bacteria function are very much shared. So things like certain antibiotics and chemical exposures that may be harmful to bacteria will also externalize harm to our mitochondria. And it's important to be mindful of that because I think ever since like germ theory became very popular, we've kind of gotten this mentality that all like bacteria are bad and we need to be in sterile environments, but it really couldn't be further from the truth that if we're really looking to optimize our mitochondria, like you mentioned before, getting out into nature where we're exposed to a lot of biodiversity of bacteria, fungi, viruses that we evolved to be exposed to support not only our microbes, but also our bodies and the functionality of our mitochondria as well.
It always comes down to as more natural you can keep it, the better it actually is for our longevity with everything, with our food, with our environment, with everything. It is always like we live so far away from nature these days that it's like kind of like we need to remind ourselves that this is where we come from. And this is also what is going to help us to lead a long and healthy life. With, of course, the medicine that we have access today, we're going to expand our life as long as possible. But if we hide in a building, being never exposed to any kind of natural surroundings, it's going to kill us. I think a lot of people don't notice that enough. That is so important and essential.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing, maybe two things worth noting here is that somebody listening might think about the fallacy. There's this appeal to nature fallacy that people that are kind of contrarians will point to in the like social media space. And they'll say like, oh, just because something's natural doesn't mean that it's good for you. But what I would urge people with this mindset to consider is the fact that our evolutionary landscape, our ancestral environments are completely different from the way that we're living today. And our bodies can't evolve quick enough to deal with the hyper novel situations that we find ourselves in as modern humans. And so in that way, getting back to a more quote unquote natural way of living is actually majorly beneficial because that's what our bodies are used to, so to speak. Our biology is used to be able to interface with that sort of environment. In the hyper novel environments that we find ourselves in today, our bodies, our biochemistry, our mitochondria are having trouble interfacing with that because it doesn't understand the exposures because they're not from the ancestral environment.
Exactly. And speaking about that, it just reminds me of another thing that is so essential for our mitochondrial health and our eating routine these days is constantly snacking and all of this, which is completely far away from how we used to live in nature. We don't have access all the time to food. If you just think about it, that is not how that's not how our body is supposed to be built, that we're constantly snacking, opening a fridge, getting all kinds of snacks, whatever we're dreaming of, even if we're not really hungry, late night snacks and whatever. That is not how our body is supposed to work. And that's why these days we don't get into autophagy anymore. Autophagy is when our cells kind of like get into starvation mode. So of course, I'm not telling people to like, okay, now you need to starve yourself throughout your life, the entire day. But it is very important to have set like time restricted eatings, periods. It is very varied, like it very varies also from woman to man, how long this should be, when this should be. But to mention this is not speaking about being more natural or like how we are supposed to like treat ourselves. The more close to nature, the better. This is also not nature, having a fridge and having access to food 24/7. So it is something that would help our mitochondrial health so much if we can get into autophagy mode more often through our daily life.
Yes. So worth mentioning here, there's kind of two homeostatic or like regulatory mechanisms that our cells use to maintain health. We have autophagy on one hand and we have apoptosis on the other hand. So apoptosis is the programmed cell death that if a cell is like too far gone, it's going to basically suicide itself because it doesn't want to hurt the whole. It's trying to basically sacrifice itself for the benefit of the whole. Autophagy, on the other hand, is kind of like the garbage man program of the cell, where any debris or damaged proteins or anything that is kind of just gunking up the cell can be broken down, and those building blocks can be recycled into new components. And as you alluded to, autophagy is really happening once we get into a certain level of a fasted state. So autophagy is kind of always happening at a low level, but as you enter a fasted state, or specifically like a lower carb state as well, which kind of mimics fasting, then we're upregulating autophagy in kind of a linear manner. So worth noting here is that in the ancestral environment and a more circadian way of living, our first meal of the day would be our largest meal of the day and probably the most carbohydrate rich, depending on the season as well. In the summertime, we have access to more plant-based foods, for example. And in the wintertime, if you're somewhere where the ground freezes, you're going to basically be eating animal fats and proteins. But then our smallest meal of the day, on the other hand, is our dinner meal. And it's usually flipped. So people are primarily here in the States eating maybe no breakfast at all, maybe like some small lunch and like mainlining coffee all day, and then they'll have a huge dinner. And what that's doing is that, especially if the dinner is very carbohydrate rich as well, now you're digesting when you're sleeping and you're pulling away from the body's ability to regenerate and restore during that time because you're diverting resources to digestion. And then you're also not getting into that really good fasted state in the latter half of the sleeping window. So we're naturally supposed to be getting into a good fat burning ketosis state in the REM cycles, which are the later cycles of sleep. But if you're eating a lot of carbohydrates at your dinner time and a big meal at dinner time, we're not going to be getting into that state. And so that means autophagy is not going to be naturally upregulated during our sleeping window. So naturally, if we're living a more circadian and like ancestral style of eating, then when we wake up from sleep in the morning, our autophagy is going to be like really going strong. And then that's going to be even further compounded if we go outside and get the morning sunlight, because the red and infrared light also helps to upregulate autophagy. And so you can kind of see in the ancestral way of being that we'll naturally be able to support autophagy and also mitophagy, which is similar to autophagy, but essentially what that's doing is breaking down damaged and like suboptimal mitochondria versus like the whole cellular components. This specifically within mitochondria, those mitochondria can be broken down. And in effect, that's purifying the mitochondrial colony. And we can get into the details about like what a damaged mitochondria looks like and what's wrong with them. But that's just to say that the way that we're living our lives is directly influencing rates of autophagy and mitophagy. And that's influencing the ability of our cells to actually thrive and be healthy because we're accumulating this gunk.
In the beginning where you said like that we should be having actually the first meal that is going to have a lot of carbohydrates and our dinner should be more smaller. It is so true that people live exactly the wrong way. Somehow, through all the years, I've always had the breakfast as my bigger meal. I think it's more culture-wise because in Germany, we have like a way of saying that in the morning you have your strongest, like your biggest meal in order to get...
But people just don't do it.
Yeah, I think maybe, I don't know. It's like the way I just was hungry in the morning. I don't know. But through all the years, I always love to have my breakfast. And it is so true that people also these days, they do another mistake, which is so commonly seen. So no breakfast, coffee first. Yeah. Wake up and first thing in the morning, coffee. They tumble into the kitchen, half awake, make a cup of coffee. This is the worst thing you can possibly do in order for your longevity, because what it is first of all, way too acidic in the morning. But second of all, it is basically kicking in your cortisol on a higher, so when you wake up, you have already a natural cortisol to wake up. And then you shot in coffee, your cortisol is basically exploding. You don't actually feel it that much, but that's also what wakes you up. But you're supposed to wake up naturally with sunlight exposure, not through a cup of coffee. And you can have coffee, like I'm not a big coffee drinker at all, but you can have coffee, but at least make sure that you wake up first naturally and maybe have a slice of bread, or if it's not bread, then some fruits, some vegetables, proteins, however your diet is. I don't want to interfere with anyone's personal diet because it's very different from everyone. So a lot of people would avoid carbs in the morning and have more proteins. And so if you have your eggs in the morning first and then have the cup of coffee, it's like some like daily simple life, because that's like something that you just mentioned from the beginning. I was like, oh yeah, so true. So many people make that so wrong.
Yeah.
And in terms of like broken mitochondria that are in your cells. So what happens if you're having damaged mitochondria and they stay in your cells? That means that the cell survival and cell death can't act as it should be. And so this is also interfering with your healing process, with building muscle, with maintaining healthy muscle. Speaking of the muscle that we build in the gym, but also speaking of the even more important muscles, I would say like your heart muscle, like your entire body, like everything. So it all like kind of like it when they stay damaged and you never get into the deep autophagy, or like the autophagy is never enough in order to like regulate this. We're basically dying, aging faster and faster with that. First of all, how would we know that we have damaged mitochondria in our body, in the cells? How would we know? What should we do?
Yeah, great question. So maybe I'll just first start by saying what happens to mitochondria when things are like going bad, let's say. So there's something, I'll define a term here briefly. It's called heteroplasmy, mitochondrial heteroplasmy, which refers to the rates of mutations within mitochondrial DNA. So as I mentioned before, mitochondria have circular DNA like their cousins, the bacteria. And this is completely distinct from the DNA that's found in the nucleus of the cell, which is the DNA that most people think of when we're thinking about DNA. That DNA in the nucleus of the cell is like half from mom, half from dad. And it's the DNA that can undergo epigenetic changes. So basically different patterns of methylation and acetylation that's going to control gene expression from those nuclear genes from mom and dad. Conversely, mitochondrial DNA comes almost exclusively from mom, because when you basically have an egg that's being fertilized by a sperm, the egg is what contains all of those mitochondria that's going to go to the newborn, to the baby. And so those mitochondria are coming from mom's side of the family. And depending on where mom's side of the family comes from in the world, that's going to change actually the kind of mitochondrial DNA that you have in there. So there's two broad classes. We have the uncoupled and we have the coupled mitochondria. And so if your ancestors come from more northern regions, you'll have an uncoupled mitochondrial haplotype is what it's called. And that uncoupled mitochondria is really good at making heat versus just making energy. So the uncoupled essentially refers to uncoupling the flow of electrons from the production of ATP. And in doing so generates heat, which is important. Metabolic heat's really important if you live in a cold region, that you need to generate that internal heat. Versus individuals who have ancestors on their mom's side that comes from the equatorial regions, they will have the coupled mitochondria, which are very good at making energy, very efficient, but they're not as good at making heat because they don't need that from their environments. And so that's kind of going to be shaped by your mom's side of the family. So then you're dealt this hand of mitochondria at birth that come from your mom. And depending on the quality of your mom's life and also your grandmother's life, because if you think about it this way, when you're born as a woman, you already have all of the eggs that you'll ever have for your life. And so what that means is when your mom was in your grandmother's womb, she already had the egg in her ovary that would become you. So that means your grandmother's life was already directly influencing the quality of the mitochondria that you'll be receiving. And so I say that because depending on the quality of those mitochondria you receive, that could lead to issues in certain organs because those mitochondria would be partitioned into different organs. Bad hand of mitochondria to your brain, for example. And then you're born and maybe you're 5 years old and you get diagnosed with a very rare form of brain cancer. Well, that's actually an epiphenomenon that's coming from the result of getting a bad hand of mitochondria dealt to that tissue during development. And so I mention that because whether you're a young child getting a mitochondrial disease or a rare cancer or any sort of chronic illness at that young age, or you're 50 years old and you're diagnosed with cancer or diabetes or neurodegeneration, any of these things, it's all a story of mitochondria. All of our chronic diseases are a story of mitochondria. And depending on the rate of mutations that are accumulating in those mitochondria, and also the starting point, is going to dictate essentially when that disease manifests, and depending on where they are, also what organ or organs will be affected. It's worth mentioning this too, because it's not like our fate is just sealed. We can do a lot to support our mitochondrial colonies and help to purify them. So what I mean by that is, let's say you have a heavy mutation burden in some mitochondria throughout your body, and we want to be able to, reverse that and reverse the mutations. Well, unlike the DNA in the nucleus, which is kind of just set at birth, the DNA in the mitochondria can actually be changed, because what we can do is engage mitophagy, which is that other branch of autophagy we mentioned before. And mitophagy will selectively kill off, let's say, the mitochondria that have the most mutations and are the most dysfunctional. And in doing so, we're then leaving behind the mitochondria that are the healthiest and working the best. And then those mitochondria can undergo what's called fission to multiply. And so in effect, by engaging mitophagy, you're also going to be increasing the proportion of healthy mitochondria that are going to produce all of the energy and support for all of the cells that are, containing those mitochondria. And so it's just really important to think about, because mitochondria not only are like at the base of all of our chronic diseases, but they're also extremely actionable. There's so much we can do from our day-to-day life to improve the function and the health of the mitochondria and purify those colonies.
So this is super interesting. That means that you as a woman basically can have the responsibility to purify your mitochondria and give that to the next generation. So if you plan on having kids, you would be the one that, even if your grandma or your own mother has had not the best lifestyle, you can take this one responsibility and change it for your kids so that you can give them on like purified mitochondria in a way. Because as you said, the mitochondria come from the mother. They are transmitted during giving birth. In terms of a partner choice, if I would say so, it's like it is super important for men, I think, to that the woman knows that, because this is seriously a woman's responsibility here, to give that on to the next generation, to the kids, to take care of herself and take care of her health. That is so interesting. And I love the fact this is like something from nature that I really love, that you can always, we all might have had mistakes. Maybe our mom, our grandma, as you said, generations before us did mistakes. They lived a party life or whatever. I don't know. In my case, thanks God, it was not like this. I think I got very lucky, having probably already purified mitochondria. But I love the fact that you can always do something against it. And even though like we had maybe a phase in the past, or if a woman is listening to this now and thinking, oh my God, my child are gonna get horrible mitochondria, this is not the case. It's never too late. You can always do something to change it, to purify it back again. And so is there a way we could like eventually measure this? Or is there a way that we could like say, okay, that could determine that maybe you should start living a more healthy life, that we could like say that?
Yes, I love this question because it's something that's always at the forefront of my mind. And a lot of the research on like mitochondrial heteroplasmy and mitochondrial biology has been spearheaded by Dr. Doug Wallace, who's out of Children's Hospital in Philadelphia. And he's up in his 80s now. So like, I'm really hoping to connect with him sooner than later, because I'm going to be building out a company with a friend of mine, an investor of a friend of mine, who is going to support me in building out commercial technology so people can assess their mitochondrial heteroplasmy or mutation rates in a variety of different areas. So we need to conduct some preclinical research first to be able to determine, basically all the different sites that we can sample from you, from your body, to be able to make conclusions about your mitochondrial quality, let's say, because a lot of the research now has been done in the preclinical setting, in the research setting, and hasn't been brought to the commercial space yet. But I think it's going to be really important and powerful, because not only can people get a so-called like score for their mitochondria, but they'll also get the set of recommendations that will be tailored to them. That's like, these are the things you need to do to improve that score, to improve your mitochondrial colonies and, benefit your health and also the health of future generations in the case of women if they're planning to have children. And I think it's going to be very, very powerful. So what I'll say is that the technology isn't necessarily there yet for commercial use, but that I'm working on it.
It is super, super interesting. That is something I find very interesting. I would be the first one to let it test because I'm very curious about that. And also I think that is something like, if that will be one day accessible for the commercial, that is something every woman should get tested before having children. That is so important. And I think also it would help us a lot in order to have a more healthy next generation, to have more healthier kids, and also kind of like motivates especially women to take care of their health and to take care of healthy mitochondria. I'm very happy that my past generations, and I know my mom is probably one of the healthiest women, and that's probably why I am so much into health since I'm a child. So I'm very optimistic about the test results, but I think that is something also just to have a control over it and for people to maybe some of them to wake up. And it's such an interesting test. Super amazing. Love that you're working on it. You have to keep me posted.
I will.
Absolutely. No, that's super interesting. If we think about, okay, people might have had a past or whatever, and we want to now take action. What would be like simple, like daily life advice that you could give, like throughout a daily life? Let's say a person who wakes up in the morning, has to go to the office, comes back home in the evening. What can we still do in order to help our mitochondria? Of course, I guess exercise, trying to get enough sleep, but what would you recommend?
Yeah, so there's a lot of actionable things that people can do. Let's take like the standard 9 to 5 person for now, because that's a lot of people. We can maybe touch on like night shift stuff after that. But so what you want to do is reconfigure your schedule to be more in alignment with circadian biology and circadian hygiene. So what that would mean is, depending on the time of year, trying to wake up within about an hour of sunrise so that you can get that morning light onto your skin and into your eyes. That's so important for turning on the pituitary gland and pregnenolone production, which is the precursor to all the sex hormones. It's also turning on your mitochondria because that red and infrared light that's enriched in morning light, it's also over 50% of midday sunlight is also red infrared, but that morning light is almost entirely red and infrared. And that's going to be turning on your mitochondria directly by stimulating metabolism in the mitochondria. So we're getting the benefit there as well. The red and infrared light is also stimulating autophagy and mitophagy as well. So it's really good to get that red and infrared light first thing after waking up, because you're already going to be in a fasted state from the overnight, assuming also you had that like smaller dinner meal, which will kind of end the cycle on there. So that would be the first thing. The second thing would be, like you mentioned before, not getting coffee first thing. You want to have a nice breakfast meal that's well-rounded and ideally seasonal and like sourced well if you can. And then second thing would be midday sun. So if you can take a break at work, even if just taking your lunch break outside and like rolling up your pants and like just trying to get some skin out in the sun is going to be great, because we need to optimize vitamin D status. We also need to get that UV light from midday sun, which is very important for controlling apoptosis, which is the other side of the homeostatic mechanism between autophagy and apoptosis. Both are very important for maintaining cell quality and the health of tissues. So the UV light component is very important, which you primarily get around solar noon, middle of the day. Now then, you're going to want to have your lunch meal, of course, which can vary also seasonally, not as important to mention here. But then later in the day, as we're approaching sundown, we want to make sure that we're limiting our blue light exposure, which we definitely got into in the last episode. Just overall minimizing blue light exposure from artificial light sources, our LEDs, our fluorescent bulbs, our screen and device screens that are highly enriched in blue light and completely devoid of red and infrared light, which in nature, if we think about it, blue light is highest in sunlight around the middle of the day, and over 50% of that midday sun is red and infrared. So we're never meant to receive blue light in isolation like we are in our artificial lights that so many people are using. So minimizing that blue light exposure as we're approaching sundown to help support our mitochondria, because that blue light actually can directly impair mitochondrial function on our surfaces, which would include our skin, our eyes, and our proximal brain regions. So it's very important to minimize those exposures, especially towards the evening, because the blue light will also inhibit melatonin release, which is required to help you go to sleep and stay asleep and get good quality sleep. Melatonin is also a really important antioxidant within mitochondria that helps to mitigate the stress response within mitochondria in almost every cell of the body, in addition to its effects on like stimulating sleep in the brain and its release from the pineal gland. So reducing light exposure after sundown, we're trying to, be in dark environments as possible. If you need to have lights on, just make them red lights. Try to wear the blue blocking glasses that we introduced in the last episode that we had. And then going to sleep in ideally a more circadian manner. So within a couple hours of sundown, ideally, so that you're getting full rest, and that dinner meal was ideally about 3 hours before bedtime, so that you're kind of fully digested by the time you're going to sleep, and you're going to get into that fasted state throughout the nighttime and get into more of a ketosis state during the REM sleep cycles later in the like early morning. And that would be like the basic routine that everybody can do to help improve their mitochondrial colonies. The one other thing that I'll add is whenever you're outside, trying to get your bare feet onto grass or even pavement is great, because we can engage in grounding or earthing, which is essentially the free exchange of electrons from the earth into your body, which also directly supports mitochondria. And then maybe one other thing that I'll add briefly is that we talked about it earlier already, but the non-native EMFs that you get from your Wi-Fi, 5G, etc., are also being detected by mitochondria. So the more we can just mitigate exposure when possible, the better off we're going to be as well. So not using your laptop like on your lap, especially for women, because you're like irradiating the ovaries and those eggs are just directly exposed, versus in men, the sperm is constantly being produced. So it's not like they're just sitting there. Not keeping your phone on your body unless it's in like airplane mode. If you have a Wi-Fi router, keeping it as far away from your bed as possible, because you don't want that to be near you while you're sleeping, as some examples. So those would be some of the major things that people would want to focus on to improve their mitochondrial health.
Yeah, just simple things actually through the day. But I think it's always like, that I think everybody knows about it, has heard about it, but it's so important to remember yourself over and over again. I have to remember myself on some of these things by myself. I can be like, oh yeah, Maren, keep in mind, go to bed earlier, do all these things. Yes, it is. It's just a great reminder always to hear of it. And sometimes you always hear something new from an expert like you, of course, in order to improve your longevity and all of that. Now, another thing that I think is very interesting is, so how would it look like if we keep broken and damaged mitochondria over a long period of time? Is it that we're going to have faster aging signs? So we're going to lose hair, that the hair turns gray faster? Is it that women, like not only women, men and women would get more wrinkles? Are these the first signs, or is it chronic disease? What are probably everything together, but what is like the signs that we could determine that we have broken and damaged mitochondria, especially when we're still young? So given the fact somebody who's in their mid-20s might have broken and damaged mitochondria just as much as somebody who's living a more healthier lifestyle, but maybe is already 60 years old.
Yep, that's a really great point. And we have quite a few things that we can look for. So one thing is that you burn really easily in your sun. I mean, one sign that you might have issues with mitochondria on your surfaces is that you burn very easily, even if you have darker skin. So like people who maybe have like more equatorial heritage, they could also get a burn if their mitochondria aren't functioning properly. And the reason for that is that melanin production in the skin requires mitochondria to be functional in the skin. So obviously if somebody's very fair and they're visiting somewhere that's like a very low latitude, of course, there's going to be some level of burning that may happen if they're overexposed. But then you can also work on building what's called solar callus, which is essentially building up your exposure slowly over time, leveraging shade, leveraging grounding, and also modulating the diet as well, making sure we're getting enough omega-3s from animal sources, ideally, and lower omega-6, for example, to mitigate the inflammatory response that can happen in response to the sun, and also skin integrity as well. But so if you're somebody who burns like immediately, that could be a sign that your skin mitochondria are not functioning as they should. It can also happen if you're wearing a lot of sunglasses, because the sun entering into your eyes, the UV light entering into your eyes is required to mount the melanin synthetic response in your skin. Also, if you're somebody who barely ever goes outside and you're living a very indoor lifestyle and you don't get any sun and you're on screens all the time and under artificial lights, that's just a dead giveaway that you're going to have issues, because that blue light will directly impair mitochondrial function. And you're also not getting the red and infrared light from your environment because all those light sources don't have any. And that red infrared light can literally penetrate all the way through your body and directly stimulate mitochondria. And so without that, we're going to run into issues. Another thing you can look for is vitamin D status. So vitamin D requires, the conversion of vitamin D in the skin from 7-dehydrocholesterol requires mitochondria as well, because water from the mitochondria is required to convert that in that first step from cholesterol to vitamin D. And so if you're getting sun and your vitamin D levels are staying low, that's also potentially a sign that you may have like mitochondrial dysfunction at the level of your skin. So that's another thing. Let's see, anything else? I mean, just in general, if we're doing a survey of somebody's lifestyle, you can kind of surmise whether or not they may have issues. They may have things like graying hair you mentioned before. Melanin is also the story of hair. That's why, like, my hair is dark. Your hair also has a different form of melanin in it. But if it goes gray, that's the absence of melanin. And again, melanin requires mitochondria functioning to be made. And so if the mitochondria in the scalp start failing, you could have hair loss, and you can also have graying of hair. And then all of our chronic diseases, so things like autoimmune diseases, neurodegeneration, cancers, diabetes, all of these diseases are signs of mitochondrial dysfunction in one or more tissues. And so if there's anybody that has a diagnosis of one of those, that's also a good sign that there's work to be done in that area.
Okay, yeah, that's like, I think it's always super interesting, because we might have younger people that live a very unhealthy lifestyle and somebody who's much older lives a very healthy lifestyle. But then how could you determine there the difference? But yeah, as you said, melatonin failing, that is probably the biggest sign. And yeah, even if I think about it, like, okay, hair loss, as you mentioned, is that 100% through like mitochondrial dysfunction, or could that also just be general like aging?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's open for debate solely because there's been an absence of research on the mitochondrial genome. And so I think a lot of what we attribute to genetics from like the DNA of the nucleus standpoint may actually be preceded by dysfunction of the mitochondria. It's just that we haven't been looking. And worth noting there is that mitochondrial dysfunction, this is Doug Wallace's research as well, dysfunction of the mitochondria and high rates of mutations within the mitochondria is associated with mutations in the nuclear DNA and negative changes to the epigenetics of the nuclear DNA that can then lead to things like cancer, for example, or maybe hair loss, things like this. And so I think we need to revisit a lot of this research to see, actually, wait, maybe this is a mitochondrial issue after all.
Most likely it is. Most likely it is an epigenetics, which is caused by mitochondrial dysfunction. So that is just going to interfere with our longevity. And those are all the signs where we would say, okay, now our mitochondria are not as healthy as they should. And that is going to, again, like interfere with our longevity, with our stem cells functioning, replacing broken and damaged cells, which means hair, skin, healing your body, maintaining a strong and healthy lifestyle.
Yeah, and I mean, worth noting here also is that in the aging and longevity space, there's a lot of talk about telomeres, and there's also a lot of talk about like the methylation clock. So essentially what that refers to is there's this pattern of methylation. Methylations are just these one carbon groups that get added to these proteins called histones, which if you zoom into the nuclear genome, nuclear DNA, the DNA is wrapped around these proteins called histones. And depending on if that histone is methylated or acetylated, which is another group, it changes what genes can be expressed, essentially. And so there's something called Horvath's clock, which was discovered like probably a decade ago or something like this, that essentially looks at the nuclear genome and looks at the pattern of methylation, and that tells you something about the biological age of an individual. Also, basically, telomeres, they get shorter as the cells keep dividing, and there's an enzyme called telomerase, which helps to lengthen them. And the shorter telomeres were previously associated with biological age as well, though I think there's been some debate on that topic. But barely anybody is talking about the mitochondrial genome and mitochondrial mutation rates or heteroplasmy in this conversation, which I think is totally misguided and like a missed opportunity, because we're now understanding through Doug's research that mitochondrial quality is going to influence the methylation status of the nuclear genome. So that's going to influence that Horvath's clock that's going to tell you like you have a higher or lower biological age. Biological age essentially referring to how old your tissues look, not like your chronological age, which is just the number of years since you were born. In addition to telomere story, which is the story about cell division, is also related to mitochondria because depending on rates of apoptosis and autophagy, that's going to influence how much a cell is pressured to divide and keep, multiplying versus keeping the cells that's already there healthy. So I think these really all just boil back down to a mitochondria story.
Exactly as you said, it always goes down to our mitochondria. Mitochondria are basically the power of our cells, and cells is the source of our living. Like this is what makes us us, and that's why we are here, breathing and being healthy. But that's really interesting about the telomeres that you were saying, and measuring your telomeres is something that is already open for the public and everybody can do that. Now, the thing is that when you have shorter telomeres, the fewer, it kind of like determines the amount of like your cell division. So the shorter your telomeres are, the shorter amount of like your cells can divide, and it eventually could give you like a biological age versus your chronological age. But I've seen studies where people were able to reverse the length of their telomeres, which is incredible. And I think this gives so much hope in this world and everybody, to motivate everybody that it's never too late to start a healthy lifestyle. It doesn't matter how old you are. So you can always start today living a healthy lifestyle and actually reverse mistakes kind of like, and it all comes down to your mitochondrial health. As you said, if you have healthy mitochondria, your telomeres will lengthen again. So I think that is something that is so motivating, so positive to know in this world, that you can like reverse mistakes and starting a healthy lifestyle today. It's never too late. And these studies are incredible. I think that is amazing. So if you do a telomere test and you see, oh, they're shorter than it's supposed to be, this is a sign for you to start taking care of your mitochondria health, because this is what leads us to longevity and will basically reverse also the length of your telomeres and maintain your entire health. So as you said, if we could measure directly our mitochondria, this would be the ultimate goal. So we don't have to measure other things around, assuming what our mitochondria are doing, because mitochondria is what is the essential. If we dig down to it, this is what everything comes down towards, is our mitochondria health.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's very exciting and hopeful. And one of the best parts about it is that it's not like we're developing this test to then sell you some drugs or pharmaceuticals that's going to reverse the problem. It's like, no, you're going to get these results and it's going to motivate you to change your lifestyle, change the way you're living. And a lot of the stuff is free. Like just trying to get outside, interact with natural spaces, get your bare feet on the ground, start to eat more locally when you can, like maybe go to a farmer's market versus going to the grocery store and buying like the packaged processed foods, eating whatever is local and available in your area. Like a lot of this stuff is very actionable, and it's not, it's not going to be an expensive drug that you need to buy and take every month for the rest of your life. Instead, it's going to be just a change in the way that you're living your life. And that's not very profitable at like the scale of like the pharmaceutical industrial complex, but it's very profitable for the individual who now will gain so much vitality and an ability to just, exert whatever their passions are into the world and become more productive individuals for their own goals versus, I think a lot of the industrial complexes that we see in modern society, especially in the West, are linked to like people just being so burned out and just non-motivated to do anything for themselves because they just become this cog in a wheel that's completely detached from like their own personal dreams. So I think the more we can focus on building a healthy lifestyle, the more power and energy we get back to be able to focus on like our real dreams into the world.
Yeah, so it is basically not a product sold to the customer. It is more like something that will help everybody to track their own health rather than taking supplements constantly, like people in the pharmaceutical world just trying to make money or something. This is something everybody can use for their own benefits to track their own health, their own mitochondria, And that is basically so essential for our longevity. I'm super excited for it. When do you think it's going to come out for the public?
Yeah, so we're definitely going to be starting prototyping process this year. And hopefully, if everything goes well, within the next 3 to 5 years, this will be on the shelves so that people can access it and start using it to help motivate themselves and improve their lives.
Yeah, super interesting. Well, it was so nice to have you here today. And yeah, thank you for coming in person again. Always love seeing you here. We always have such a good time together.
Yeah, this was so fun. Well, I'm sure we'll do it again soon.
Of course.
Thank you for listening to Health Hacks. I hope today's episode gave you more knowledge to improve your health.